How do you get started with intermittent fasting? What can you expect in those first couple of weeks, as well as what might be the better method for you to get started? And in this video, I want to share with you my experience as a coach and as someone who's been doing intermittent fasting in a variety of different forms since 2010, and something that might help you just get there easier, just get through that initial period easier, because you will know what might happen. So a lot of benefits out there. I mean, a lot of success stories, a lot of testimonials from people claiming, hey, I lost fat easier, I could stay in a caloric deficit easier, there's less hunger, I'm more productive, I get more clarity, I'm less stressed, I think about food less, and all these are great benefits. I can definitely tell you that I personally experienced all of them. But in the first couple of weeks, specifically in the first 2 weeks of intermittent fasting, you might not feel any of these benefits. Actually, you might feel pretty bad, and especially if you're in a caloric deficit. And when you first get started, I started with that 16-8 type of fasting, the lean gains approach, with 16 hours of fast and 8 hours of eating window. Basically, that meant that when I was waking up at 8 a.m. that I wouldn't have any food until 12. So no calories, 0 calories in that 4-hour period. And what happened was that after an hour, which would normally I would have breakfast immediately after I was waking up, I was used to eating about 4 to 5 meals a day, I would feel that I'm getting a lot more hungrier. My stomach would start making all these weird noises. I would get a lot of cravings for food, especially after that first hour when my body was expecting a meal and that food wasn't coming. So what was wrong was that I was suddenly changing my meal pattern and my body didn't want to change, right? Every change is hard. So it takes a while to adapt, and also some of the effects more on that psychological side was that I was less focused. Actually, I was thinking more about food. It was almost like having this countdown timer in my head. Okay, when it's gonna be noon so I can finally have my meal. And this is something, not just my experience, this is also what my clients have experienced, is that they get a lot more moody, you actually experience a little bit more stress, and especially if you're in a caloric deficit, which already impacts most of these things, and now you're starting to eat in a tighter window in the day, so it might even get a little bit worse. So this is something to expect, and oftentimes people will give up in the first 2 weeks because of this, because they expect, well, those benefits that most people claim, they don't work for me. You know, I feel more hungry, I feel more cravings, I crave everything, and I just can't wait for that meal, and no matter how much green tea or coffee or water I drink, I still feel like that. Well, that's completely normal. So for the first 2 weeks, that's completely fine, and then after that 2 weeks, then you can kind of start getting more adapted and judge the approach, whether it works for you or not. But initially, a lot of people give up, and the analogy that I like to use here is that, let's say you walk into a store and you want to buy a pair of pants, and you get a pair of pants, you put them on, and you say, okay, this doesn't work. This size is wrong. I don't like this type of pants. It feels very, very uncomfortable. And you say, okay, I'm never going to wear pants again. All right? So you just gave up after trying the first pair. Would anybody ever do that? And as like a normal person, you would say, okay, let's return these pants. The store is full of different types of pants. So let's find the type and the size that works for me. Similarly, with fasting, there's a lot of different types of approaches. If you find that this form of 16-8 doesn't work for you after a couple of weeks, I would say give it at least a month, you might try out a different approach, maybe something like a 12-12 or an alternate day fasting, or something like a 5-2 where you fast only for 2 days out of the week and then you do 5 days of just regular eating pattern. So it's important to experiment and try to find something that really works for you in the moment. And that's a really important factor of any dietary approach, is to find what works for you and what fits your lifestyle. So how can you get started? Let's break it down into two very, very simple methods. Method one is the good old cold turkey. Basically, you just start immediately eating in that 8-hour window and doing that 16-hour fast. And keep in mind here, I'm focused mainly on that lean gains approach, which I think for most people watching this video might be the most interesting one. That is the one that will maximize the results you're going to get out of your efforts in the gym. At least from the data we currently have, there's not a lot of scientific data on actual building muscle and all these other factors when it comes to intermittent fasting. So with limited data, we can say that the 16-8 approach definitely works fine, and that is a really good approach if you want to maximize results in terms of body composition, getting more muscle and losing body fat, while at the same time getting the benefits from fasting. So going back to method one, what it really comes down to is just you start. You start going from tomorrow. You say, okay, I'm doing intermittent fasting, and from then on, I am just eating in this window, right? You pick a window of 8 hours in the day where you're gonna start. If you're, let's say, waking up at 8 in the morning like I used to do that, I would just start eating at 12, last meal at 8, and that's it. In the periods where I would feel a little bit hungry, I would rely on green tea, I would rely on coffee, I would rely on lemon water, basically no calories whatsoever. And also I would make sure to schedule some of the work that I had after the first meal, especially if the work was on more of a creative side where I had to write articles or do something like that. I would make sure to push that after the first meal. And also if there's some kind of meeting or working with other people, especially in that initial period where you're a little bit stressed, it's probably not a good idea to work in some kind of team environment where you have to make snap judgments and you have to work with a ton of people, because that requires a lot more effort, focus, and productivity. And if you are impacted by intermittent fasting, you might even tell the people at work, hey, I'm trying something new. If I'm saying something that doesn't make a little bit of sense, or if I'm getting a little bit anxious about something, that's to be expected in the first couple of weeks. So you can tell people like your partner who you're living with or something like that, so they can expect to know some of these symptoms. So moving on, method one is really clear, and within 2 weeks you're probably going to get adapted and all those symptoms will go away, at least for the most part. So if you're still on a diet, you can expect to be hungry all the time after, if you reach a very low body fat percentage. There's nothing you can do to completely avoid hunger, but still, you can mitigate that to a great deal after the first couple of weeks, and intermittent fasting in general will help you feel less hungry and have a more regular meal pattern where you have a fixed, simplified day where it's just, okay, 8 hours and that's it. There's no kind of snacking here or there, getting used to different types of meal patterns. No, it's pretty fixed and flexible in a way that, okay, I'll do within 8 hours what I want, but out of that, it's completely fixed. So that's the first method. The method two, that is kind of more like a progressive shrinking of the window, is actually the preferred method that I like to use with a lot of clients, especially female clients, is that you start by shrinking the window. First off, whatever you used to eating, maybe like 4 or 5 meals, you say, hey, I'm gonna eat 3 to 4 meals, and I'm gonna start with a 12-12 for the first 2 weeks. So for the first 2 weeks, you just basically not eat anything for 2 hours after waking up, and then 2 hours before you go to bed. So in that example of going to bed at midnight, waking up at 8 in the morning, you basically have your first meal around 10 and then your last meal around 10 p.m. So that's kind of how it would work, and basically you won't feel that much difference from a regular approach because you have to push your breakfast only for about an hour or so. So it's not a big deal. For most people, this doesn't feel like they're trying intermittent fasting, but it kind of gives you that first initial kind of step into it. And then after the first 2 weeks, you move into a more of a rigid approach. So you go with a 14-10. So now the first meal is not at 10, it's at 11, and the last meal is at 9 p.m. So it's kind of like tightening up a little bit. And then from then on, after 2 weeks, you go more into that 16-8. And if you even want to make it tighter afterwards, you can go for, let's say, something like a 24. In some cases that even people want to push themselves. So they want to go for a 4-hour eating window and go with a 20-hour fast, which is something that's completely fine. Especially if you're not looking to fully maximize your muscle growth, that 24 is completely a viable approach for someone who just wants to lose weight, wants to look good, wants to get that regular physique, that warrior type of body, that Hollywood actor physique. 2010, 24 will work. It doesn't even have to be that 16-8 or that other approach. For me personally, what I've found that I gravitate mainly between, let's say, the 14-10 and the 16-8. That's where I'm at usually. So I'm a big fan of the 14-10 because it's a little bit less rigid. It just gives me a little bit more room, so I feel like a little bit more flexible and I can adhere to it much better. And generally you can mix this up. You can go one day with that 4 and then go for 20 hours of fasting, and then the other day you can go with 16-8 if you want to try to push yourself. But the method 2 will take longer, right? The method 2, the progressively shrinking of the window, will take a bit longer, but you will be fully adapted. So now the question is, which one is for you? Which method should you take? Well, the method 1 is kind of that front loading of the pain. If you want to challenge yourself, if you feel like that your life can take it, look at your lifestyle, see if you can really take that kind of stress in the early part of the day, sure, then go for it, try it out. And if you're a little bit more stressed, if you have a lot of things going on in your life, if you want to be maximally productive in the first 4 hours of the day, probably method 2 will work for you better, and you can kind of progressively get into that. So there's no right method, as I said. Experiment or try out different types of pants on and see which one fits for you, right? You cannot know before you try. Self-experimentation goes a long way. Similarly with intermittent fasting, in the whole journey since 2010, I've tried out different types of approaches, and I've tried protein sparing modified fasts, I've tried 16/8, I've tried 24, I've tried alternate day fasting. I mean, they all have their different little benefits, as well as on some days you just don't feel like you need to eat that much. So it's kind of okay to experiment and go with a little bit of longer or a shorter window, depending how you feel, right? So listen to your body a little bit. It's a great way to know what real hunger feels like compared to just that psychological hunger or just that getting used to that standard meal pattern. So it's a really, really beneficial approach. Hope you guys enjoyed. This is a quick guide on how to get started with intermittent fasting. Let me know in the comments below if you have any questions. And aside from that, make sure to hit that subscribe button below to support the channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.